Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Polyvagal Theory, Neurophysiological Foundations of Emotions, Attachment, Communication, and Self-Regulation, by Stephen W. Porges. Narrated by Joe Hempel. Publisher's note: this audiobook refers to figures and tables included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Foreword. Bessel A. Vanderkolk. It is an extraordinary experience to hear a new piece of music, or a novel scientific idea that makes you sit up in wonder and turns on a bank of lights in your mind that permanently transforms how you understand what life is all about. Seeing Peter Sellers' production of The Marriage of Figaro, listening to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross lecture on schizophrenia when I was a medical student, and hearing Steve Mayer talk about the neurobiology of inescapable shock at the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology in 1984 were three such unforgettable events for me. On the morning of May 21st, 1999, we had the most memorable series of lectures of the 22 years that I have run the annual Boston Trauma Conference. The day opened with Bruce McEwen talking about stress and the hippocampus. He introduced the notion of neuroplasticity and showed that Ramon E. Cajal's dire dictum that anatomy is destiny, that the neuronal connections in the brain are immutably fixed, was incorrect. Jaak Panksepp, whose work has delineated the brain circuits that underlie nurturance, fear, rage, and rough-and-tumble play, was next. The final speaker that morning was Stephen Porges, who talked about the polyvagal theory of emotions. That lecture caused a fundamental shift in how I and many of my colleagues understand the work we do. Clinicians and researchers who deal with people with histories of chronic trauma are routinely confronted with fight, flight, or freeze reactions. Our patients, and occasionally colleagues, easily take offense, and they often disorganize their and our lives by becoming too angry, too ashamed, and too frozen. Minor irritations easily turn into catastrophes. Small failures of communication are difficult to gloss over and easily turn into dramatic interpersonal conflicts. The milk of human kindness, such an essential nutrient in making life bearable, all too often fails to have a significant impact on the despair, rage, and terror of people with histories of trauma and abandonment. When post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, first made it into the diagnostic manuals, we only focused on dramatic incidents like rape, assaults, or accidents to explain the origins of the emotional breakdowns in our patients. Gradually, we came to understand that the most severe dysregulation occurred in people who, as children, lacked a consistent caregiver. Emotional abuse, loss of caregivers, inconsistency, and chronic misattunement showed up as the principal contributors to a large variety of psychiatric problems. One of the most important discoveries in psychology, neuroscience, and psychiatry has been that failure in establishing secure early attachment bonds leads to a diminished capacity to regulate negative emotions. Harlow and his students were the first to show the devastating effects of abandonment and loss on affect regulation in non-human primates. Half a century of attachment research has shown that people learn to regulate their emotional arousal largely as a function of the capacity to establish physical and rhythmical attunement with important figures in their early caretaking environment. Attachment researchers, starting with John Bowlby, have long shown that the internal regulatory processes of an individual reflect to a large degree the attunement with external sources of regulation early in life. Having a history of chronic misattunement with one's caregivers predisposes people to have difficulties managing negative emotions later in life. Sadly, deficient affect regulation caused by early adverse experiences is compounded by the resulting off-putting behaviors in the face of stress, such as temper tantrums and emotional withdrawal. Dysregulated behavior alienates potential friends and patterns and interferes with being able to garner support and accumulate restorative experiences. Lack of affect regulation thus runs the danger of becoming a vicious cycle, where deficient self-control leads to abandonment, which in turn makes it even more difficult to regulate negative mood states. The problem does not end there, since routine psychiatric interventions are quite ineffective in helping people manage their emotions, and the best that medications generally can do is to dull emotional arousal of any kind, thereby robbing people of pleasure and of pain simultaneously. Traditional psychotherapies also do not offer much immediate relief, since being unable to manage emotional arousal interferes with being able to benefit from treatments such as cognitive behavioral therapy. Problems with affect regulation have pervasive effects on the development of mind and brain, and lead to significant increases in the utilization of medical, correctional, social, and mental health services. Many problems of children and adults with histories of chronic trauma and neglect can be understood as efforts to minimize objective threat and to regulate their emotional distress, and hence they are liable to be labeled as oppositional, rebellious, unmotivated, and antisocial. Our study of patients with abuse and neglect histories was helped enormously by the developments in affective neuroscience, which clarified the underlying neurobiology of many problems seen in these patients. Particularly helpful was Panksepp's work that elucidated the brain structures and neural circuits involved in the basic emotional systems: seeking, rage, fear, lust, care, panic, and play. But understanding the limbic circuits of emotions still did not account for the precipitous shifts we see in our patients and their lack of responsiveness to the voices and faces of people who care for them, input that helps most people calm down and regain mastery over their senses. The question remained: what causes the emotional systems of some people to be hijacked so easily by slight changes in visual, auditory, kinesthetic, or olfactory input? More than a decade ago, we became interested in a possible role of heart rate variability, HRV, in the maintenance of these emotional roller coasters. This gave us our first exposure to Porges' polyvagal theory. When we started to measure HRV, we observed that people who maintained relatively stable HRV while remembering horrendous personal events did not seem to suffer from PTSD, whereas people with PTSD generally had poor HRV. Porges' polyvagal theory provided us with an organizing principle for that observation, built on the work of prior scientists such as Charles Darwin and William James, which explained the central role of human interactions and body sensations in our emotional lives. Up to the time that we learned about the polyvagal theory, we had been taught that the autonomic nervous system is organized by the paired antagonism between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems, which functionally compete by either increasing or decreasing activity of specific target organs. The introduction of the polyvagal theory vastly expanded this model with an emphasis on the social, myelinated vagus as the fine-tuning regulatory system that opens up a role for the environment to foster or ameliorate stress-related physiological states. Porges proposes that phylogenetically, a hierarchical regulatory stress response system emerged in mammals that not only relies on the well-known sympathetic adrenal activating system and the parasympathetic inhibitory vagal system, but that these systems are modified by myelinated vagus and the cranial nerves that regulate facial expression, which constitute the social engagement system. Thus, phylogenetically, self-regulatory development starts with a primitive behavioral inhibition system, progresses by the evolution of a fight-flight system, and, in humans and other primates, culminates in a complex social engagement system mediated by facial gestures and vocalizations. Thus, the mammalian myelinated vagus functions as an active vagal brake that supports rapid behavioral mobilization, as well as the capacity to physiologically stabilize an individual by means of interoceptive visceral awareness, as well as social interaction. According to Porges, this evolutionary development allows social interactions to stabilize physiological arousal by means of facial expressions, speech, and prosody. When the environment is appraised as being safe, the defensive limbic structures are inhibited. This makes it possible to be socially engaged with calm, visceral states. Breakdown of affect regulation. When the system breaks down, as we witness particularly under conditions of extreme stress, the social vagus no longer can stabilize the organism, The physiological cohesion that forms the basis of the interpersonal neurobiological communication between different organisms breaks down, and the phylogenetically older systems will be recruited to regulate metabolic output to deal with environmental challenges. As long as people and animals feel threatened, they cannot meaningfully engage with members of their tribe and will resort to more primitive and solipsistic fight or flight behaviors, mobilization mediated by the sympathetic nervous system, to ensure survival. Under conditions of inescapable danger, even fight or flight breaks down, which leads to immobilization, with a resulting behavioral shutdown and syncope via the unmyelinated vagus. This theory made perfect sense and tied together numerous observations from attachment research, animal ecology, anthropology, and trauma research. To survive and thrive, mammals must be able to distinguish friend from foe, know when a situation is safe or dangerous, and adjust their behavior to the demands of the social group. Porges' observations clarified the mechanisms that allow humans and animals to be physically approached, what ties members of the group together, and how the cohesion of the social group is a central element in managing life's stresses. The Polyvagal Theory also helps us understand the capacity of the tone of voice and rhythms of speech, as well as faces of our loved ones, to restore our physiological equilibrium. Visceral experiences. Another important contribution of the polyvagal theory is a clarification of the relation between visceral state and emotional expression. Trauma researchers understood early on that the body keeps the score, that the memory of trauma is encoded in visceral experiences such as heartbreaking and gut-wrenching emotions, in autoimmune disorders, and in skeletal muscular problems. Porges proposed that afferent feedback from the viscera contributes in a major way to the accessibility of prosocial circuits associated with social engagement. For example, mobilization changes our ability to detect positive social cues, and immobilization may make a person impervious to positive input. Visceral states color our perception of ourselves and our surroundings. The physiological state the person is in precipitates very different outcomes in response to the presentation of the same stimuli. Internal bodily states are represented in the insula and contribute to subjective feeling states. The insula, which is frequently found to be abnormally activated in neuroimaging studies of traumatized individuals, is involved in the perception of danger and mediates the feedback from the viscera into cognitive awareness. Darwin and James both proposed that visceral experience is a critical element in the experience of emotions and central to their understanding of happiness, fear, anger, disgust, and sadness. Most people are able to gauge danger and love by means of their gut feelings, which generally accurately detect relative the danger or safety of their situation. People with impaired social engagement systems are prone to misinterpret safety as a threat and objective danger as safety. Their visceral feedback system fails to protect them or prevents them from engaging in the fullness of what life has to offer. People who are chronically traumatized have a tendency to become overwhelmed and triggered by their seemingly unmanageable visceral feedback systems that cannot be modified by a functional social engagement system. Consequently, they try to inhibit sensory feedback from their bodies and experience the feedback from both their bodies and the world around them as bland and meaningless. Our observation that traumatized individuals habitually engage in body-based defensive maneuvers led us to incorporate the work of such body-based therapists as Peter Levine and Pat Ogden into our treatment armamentarium. In fact, Peter Levine introduced me to Stephen Porges. Implications for treatment. The polyvagal theory of emotions has had a profound effect on helping us organize the treatment of abused children and traumatized adults. True, we might have developed a yoga program for chronically traumatized women anyway, because they so obviously benefit from learning to calm themselves down by learning to manage their breathing and engaging in challenging physical poses that put them in touch with their dissociated bodies. We also probably would have had a theater program in the Boston inner-city schools where traumatized kids learn to play by engaging in rhythmical movements and attuned collaborative exercises. And my friend Tina Packer would have taught Shakespeare to juvenile delinquents anyway, because her profound knowledge of the effects of hexameters and embodying the physical roles of Julius Caesar, Romeo and Juliet, and Richard III compelled her to teach these dysregulated adolescents to engage in and move between deep and varied physiological, and hence mental, states by linking the repressive features of emotion with their visceral responses. My colleagues Robert Macy and Steve Gross would have developed their play techniques and Qigong-based therapies that they apply in inner-city schools and to survivors of tsunamis, earthquakes, and political violence around the world, even if they would never have learned the Polyvagal Theory. But the Polyvagal Theory ties all these disparate, unconventional techniques together, in that they all activate situations that, in the past, have precipitated the participants into uncontrollable flight or fight and freeze modes, which, with these various techniques that rely on interpersonal rhythms, visceral awareness, and the primary use of vocal and facial communication, attempt to reorganize the perception of danger and capacity to manage emotional engagement. It is difficult to trace all the sources of one's inspiration, but Porges's polyvagal theory gave us a powerful means of understanding how both bodily states and mental constructs dynamically interact with environmental triggers to precipitate maladaptive behaviors. Porges helped us understand how dynamic our biological systems are, and he gave us an explanation why a kind face and a soothing tone of voice can dramatically alter the entire organization of the human organism. That is, how being seen and understood can help shift people out of disorganized and fearful states. We had long realized that psychopathological states rarely are static and tend to fluctuate greatly depending on the safety of the environment and the psychological state in which people find themselves. The proposal that our physiological states are flexible and depend on both our relationship to our visceral experiences and the state of our relationships promises to decrease our dependence on drug treatment alone to shift people into a different psychological organization. Recognizing the critical role of visceral afferent feedback on the global functioning of the brain inevitably leads to curiosity about the non-pharmacological treatments that have so long been practiced outside of Western medical approaches. Age-old traditions of changing mental states with specific breath exercises, body movements, Qigong, Tai Chi, Taekwondo, and yoga, and rhythmical activities, such as kendo drumming and davening. Several psychiatric disorders are characterized by difficulties in establishing and maintaining relationships, including difficulty both in expressing social behavior and in reading social cues, that is, social awareness. Several psychiatric diagnoses are associated with specific deficits in both the behavioral, for example, poor gaze, low facial affect, lack of prosody, and visceral, difficulties in autonomic regulation resulting in cardiopulmonary and digestive problems, components of the social engagement system. If physiological mind-brain-viscera communication is the royal road to affect regulation, this invites a radical shift in our therapeutic approaches to a number of psychopathological states, such as anxiety, attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, autism, and trauma-related psychopathology. Such a shift, for which there appears to be increasing support with increased funding by both the Department of Defense and the National Institute of Health of such approaches as yoga, martial arts, and acupuncture studies, would ask us to cultivate interpersonal rhythms, nurture the capacity for people to use their voices and faces to regulate emotional states, and explore various body-mind techniques that integrate visceral and emotional experiences. The polyvagal theory legitimates the study of age-old collective and religious practices such as communal chanting, various breathing techniques, and other methods that cause shifts in autonomic state. The polyvagal theory implies that more attention needs to be paid to the development of interventions that either promote activation of the social vagus or dampen sympathetic tone. One major implication is the need to pay closer attention to the therapeutic use of play, rough and tumble behaviors that serve as preliminary exercises to develop adaptive, defensive, and aggressive behaviors as a means of shifting people out of fight or flight reactions into loving and mutually engaged mobilization. Introduction. Why is there a polyvagal theory? The polyvagal theory emerged from a dialectic between my curiosity in biobehavioral systems and my dissatisfaction with the prevalent models that integrated physiological state with behavior. When I started my scientific career, I was intrigued with the possibility of using physiological measures to understand the psychological states of others. In the late 1960s, when I was in graduate school, I had the vision that monitoring physiological state would be a helpful guide to the therapist during the clinical interaction. This vision is still part of my research agenda. I'm still working on developing a polyvagal monitor which will provide feedback in real time to clinicians of the dynamic interplay between the three neural circuits described in the polyvagal theory. In the 1960s, the constructs and models relating physiology to behavior were limited. Dominant in the human and psychophysiological literature was a construct of arousal. The defining features of arousal were vague. However, psychophysiologists assumed that arousal was mediated by the sympathetic nervous system. Early psychophysiologists, such as Chester Darrow, proposed continuity between cortical activation measured through electroencephalography, EEG, and sympathetic arousal measured by the galvanic skin resistance response on the hands. This view of a peripheral indicator of brain processes was consistent with Pavlov's use of autonomic measures in his classical conditioning experiments. For Pavlov, the classically conditioned autonomic responses were indices of changes in brain circuits. Arousal is still used in sleep research to describe cortical activation and in research on deception in which traditional polygraphs are used. The specific physiological and neurophysiological mechanisms underlying arousal are often associated with the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis. An inferred connection between the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis has resulted in similar research methods being used to study both arousal and stress. The sympathetic-centric view has been translated into the popular press and public consciousness as a cliché that a limited amount of stress is good and too much stress is bad. But what were the thresholds of stress necessary for health or illness? In addition, consistent with the sympathetic-centric view, we all were taught that stress-related sympathetic excitation had evolutionary origins in mammalian fight-or-flight behaviors. Thus, we were taught that the increased sympathetic tone to novelty and danger was a reflection of our evolutionary history. At the time of my introduction to psychophysiology, physiological measures were proposed as a portal into psychological processes without requiring conscious awareness or verbal responses. The exciting discipline, however, was constrained by a limited understanding of the neural mechanisms regulating the physiological measures being monitored, and an adequate understanding of the mediating neural mechanisms linking peripheral autonomic responses to the psychological processes of interest to the psychophysiologist. Psychophysiology was established in the early 1960s as a discipline merging features of psychology, medicine, physiology, and engineering. The Society for Psychophysiological Research was formed in 1960, and the first issue of Society's journal Psychophysiology was published in 1964. During its early years, psychophysiology distinguished itself from physiological psychology by focusing on physiology as a dependent variable and psychological factors, for example, threat, novelty, and processes, for example, attention, mental effort, emotion, as independent variables. In contrast, physiological psychology manipulated physiology, independent variable, and monitored changes in behavior and psychological processes, that is, dependent variable. In general, psychophysiologists studied human subjects in their research paradigms, whereas physiological psychologists studied animals. I joined the Society for Psychophysiological Research in 1968 and attended my first meeting in 1969. The early meetings were exciting. and many of the initial pioneers in the society had been successful scientists in other domains. During my more than 40 years of membership, I was involved in the society as a member of the board, secretary-treasurer, and president. During this period, research interests and methods shifted from peripheral measures of the autonomic nervous system to measures of brain function employing EEG, event-related potentials, and functional magnetic resonance imaging methods. Current issues of psychophysiology reflect this trend and focus on measures of brain function during cognitive and affective challenges. An important consequence of this history, physiological variables were seen as correlates of psychological processes. This view allowed researchers to study parallels between physiology and behavior without understanding the underlying relationship between these domains. Basically, there are two global domains in the biobehavioral sciences. One, behavioral, observable, and psychological, subjective, and two, physiological, peripheral autonomic, and neural, brain. Paradigms that correlate physiology and behavior or use physiological variables as a biomarker of a clinical disorder are the consequence of a modern Western scientific solution to the historical remnant of the mind-body problem. The current scientific solutions of dualism are not solutions, but merely objective descriptions of parallel functions with exquisite technologies. Many scientists and disciplines are stuck in the dualism trap. New disciplines have emerged such as cognitive neuroscience, affective neuroscience, social neuroscience, health psychology, and several subdisciplines within public health that use the methods that were developed in psychophysiological research to provide biomarkers of illness. Currently, measures of heart rate variability and neuroendocrine activity, for example, cortisol, oxytocin, vasopressin, are frequently described as potential biomarkers of clinical health and risk. The Polyvagal Theory challenges this implicit dualism by providing a bidirectional brain-body model that interprets the brain regulation of peripheral physiology, for example, neural regulation of both cardiovascular and endocrine function, as providing a neural platform for emergent adaptive social and defensive behaviors. The academic arena of the late 1960s had a limited conceptualization of the brain's role in regulating peripheral physiology. Because the details of potential mechanisms mediating the link between psychological processes and physiology were unknown, scientists were comfortable with investigations applying physiological measures as correlates of psychological processes and potential biomarkers of mental and physical health. In 1970, I matriculated into this academic arena with my doctorate and started conducting independent research as an assistant professor. The roots of the polyvagal theory emerged while conducting research on heart rate correlates of attention for my master's thesis. In this study, I noted that when subjects focused their attention on the task demands, the beat-to-beat heart rate pattern stabilized. The publication of the master's thesis became the first quantitative description of heart rate variability as a response variable sensitive to psychological manipulations. My dissertation followed this theme by testing the relation between heart rate variability and reaction time performance. The dissertation confirmed that greater reductions in heart rate variability were associated with faster reaction times. Moreover, the study identified that individual differences in heart rate variability predicted reaction time performance and the degree to which heart rate variability was suppressed while attending. Throughout the following 40 years, although methodologies and research questions have changed, my laboratory research has continued to conduct studies monitoring heart rate and quantifying heart rate variability. How did an observation that heart rate stabilized during attention lead to the polyvagal theory? There were a few intervening conceptualizations. First, I had to link the changes in heart rate variability to vagal mechanisms. This was accomplished through two stages. First, the development of quantification techniques to characterize the rhythms in the beat-to-beat heart rate pattern, and second, conducting validation studies to demonstrate that the amplitude of the respiratory rhythm in heart rate, that is, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, was a valid indicator of vagal influences to the heart. By the early 1980s, this was in place. The ideas coalesced, and the concept of vagal tone was concretized in a vagal tone monitor and software to enable other laboratories to use this sensitive index. Although developed 30 years ago, the method I created for quantifying heart rate variability.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?